welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's good to have you here. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, and I've written some books, the most recent being In the House of Tom Bombadil, and I'm working on 4 books at the present, and the most kind of urgent book that I need to finish is a book on totalitarianism. Anyway, that's going to be relevant for the subject of the show, but before we get into that, Tom and Glenn, why don't you introduce yourselves? Let's start with you, Tom.
Tom Price. I teach systematic theology and Christian ethics, one of the places at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
And I'm Glenn Sunshine, retired history professor, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries.
Okay, great. Well, it's my show today, and so I've decided arbitrarily, like a dictator, like a totalitarian, that we're going to talk about knowledge. And we're going to talk about why knowledge is more than power. So we know the statement attributed to Francis Bacon, knowledge is power, which, by the way, I had this fun thing I read here where a guy actually thought that the full statement was, knowledge is power, France is bacon. And for like years, he thought that was what everybody was getting at when they were talking about Francis Bacon. Anyway, it's a person, a guy named Francis, and his last name was Bacon. But on this matter of knowledge is power, that's more or less accepted as a truism today. Almost as though that's just so obvious. Why did you even need to state that? We all know that knowledge is power. But is that really the case? Or is knowledge more than power? Or is knowledge and power a set of things that kind of are connected in a wide range of ways, and perhaps we're missing some of those ways? Anyway, that's what I'd like to talk about today. Do you guys have any thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, before you get there, actually, in some ways, Foucault and to some extent Derrida inverted that. They said those with power determine what qualifies as knowledge.
Yeah. And I do actually think it's relevant to the things I want to reflect on, because I think in our time, people use power as the test of knowledge. So whether or not it gets you what you want, in a pragmatic way, is what determines whether or not it's genuine knowledge. Yeah. And I'd like to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, Foucault does it a little bit differently. He says that what the people who have cultural power are the ones who dictate what constitutes knowledge. So there are some kinds of knowledge that the people with cultural power accept. There are some kinds of knowledge that they reject. And this is why all knowledge ends up being a cultural construct, according to Foucault. But there is a connection between power and knowledge. It's just not quite the one that Bacon outlines. And I think that's really a lot of what's behind CT right now.
And I think, Chris, you hinted the point that, it gets us what we want. And it's when knowledge and power are extensions of will, which becomes very central. And then one of the things Foucault was aware of, and this is something that carries on into the critical theories, is that they see those who have the capacity to exert their will on everyone else and do it through creating what is, the construct of knowledge, constructing truth, as basically the only one that has real freedom, the ability to enact their will on things, are those that have the most power, right? So there is this play between the freedom of some to exert their will, usually the powerful, and then their freedom to construct for everyone else what truth and knowledge is, because that allows their will to exercise more and more control over things. But there is, like Glenn said, there's a play between the knowledge and power of the Enlightenment and its inversion in the kind of postmodern thinkers like Foucault and Derrida.
Yeah, I'd like to think a little bit about this, and what I have to present are just some, sort of mental, I guess, constructions that I'm developing that are is still in process. This is all nascent. This is all stuff that could be refined, developed, and so forth. So more or less what I'm saying is that the arguments that I'm presenting here are not final. They're in important ways qualified. But I do think they relate. Some of my thinking relates to these things that we've just been talking about. This is familiar territory for all of us. But as I've thought about what Bacon was up to, Baconian science, and what I think many people who share his convictions in his project have in mind, does actually relate to this stuff. So let's think about it this way. What Bacon was getting at was a way of apprehending, understanding the physical processes of the world so that we could leverage them in ways that help us to exercise control or dominion over the physical world. So say the power to create air conditioning. On a hot, humid day in Kansas City, when the temperature is 98 degrees and the dew point is at the same number, it's a very uncomfortable place to be. And when you walk into an air-conditioned space, you say, "Thank you, Francis Bacon." because if it wasn't for this insight, we would bake even more on the inside than on the outside. So there is a real sense in which this insight is helpful, and it's produced a number of marvelous things. Furthermore, getting back to our notions of social power, there were, if we take Foucault, Derrida, and their sort of way of thinking about things, we could say that in every society, not just Western society, there has been a combination of knowledge and power. And when you know the right things, you can exercise power in that social environment. So let's just say Native Americans. So Native Americans, even though they're minority groups, in the current situation that they find themselves in. Once upon a time, they were running the show here in North America. and then within their various tribal groups, there were people who had power, more power than other people, and governed those groups. You could talk about chiefs, shaman, whatever. And so there was a social environment in which power was unevenly distributed, and there were powerful people or less powerful people. Now, when Europeans came on the scene, European powers had their own ways of organizing their societies, but they had a kind of power that these other societies did not. It didn't kind of just get reduced to the size of the population or any of that. It came down to a particular kind of knowledge that allowed Europeans to exercise power in ways that the Native Americans could not. Example, gunpowder, rifles, that kind of stuff, communications. All of that was really instrumental to the conquest of North America. And there's nobody who can deny that. So that's not merely a social construct. There was real power that the European powers possessed that the Native Americans did not. That's why they wanted the guns. That's why they wanted the horses. That's why they wanted these different things in order to be able to resist. They knew that their own technologies did not have the kind of ability to project force like the European powers did. So that's what Bacon was getting at. And I want to explore that a little bit and kind of entertain the idea that he's half right, but not even half. There's a huge dimension of knowledge that this particular way of thinking fails to appreciate and apprehend. Anyway, I know I've said some things that give you plenty of stuff to react to. So go ahead, react away.
Just as a reminder, I think we've talked about this before. Tolkien and Lewis both equated the Baconian project of acquiring knowledge to acquire power over nature with magic.
Right.
Yeah. They saw both magic and science/technology as rooted in the same impulse of us exerting our will over the world or over other people.
Yeah. And this would be true for Native Americans. So let me just stay with them for the sake of consistency. There were medicine men. There were men who claimed to be able to work magic and use their their technology, right? Their technology that helped them to exert spiritual power, and that they were able to use that to oversee and govern their own communities. But it was no match when it came time to face the Europeans. So we have to. That's true. So there was magic and there was science, and they both were trying to control the physical environment, but one proved to be more consistent than the other.
And then you also had that coupled with a lot of that was the first pangs in Europe of Enlightenment thinking that severed some of the moral constraints that Christianity had placed on things and should have given a fuller expression to, and then tied certain distorted views of Christian domination with conquest, and so that you did see power, the development of a kind of instrumental control over natural conditions, as natural science really took off and allowed technology to develop, weaponry, naval forces, all the different crafts as something very Christian, which is that there is an intelligible order to things, and things have kind of natures that unfold. And the kind of ability we have as humans to understand this process and shape it, right? But as that gets shifted, in a different direction than when Tolkien was up to, right? As being a co-creator, this became as if we were almost creators of the same nature that God is, as if we have as if we're almost like micro versions of omnipotence, right? That we can exert our will through this knowledge and direct things in accord with the way we want them to be. And I think you have there a real strong cocktail between Christianity and its distortion by a new kind of magic, which I think Bacon is an exemplification of.
Yeah, I think, zeroing in on this, what we have in Christianity is a set of spiritual constraints that were sloughed off, but that sloughing off was not unconnected to the rise of modern science. Mm-hmm. So when we think about the rise of modern science, it's a reaction to an Aristotelian science that considers things in a fuller way than modern science does. So, for example, forms and ends. So forms and ends were inseparable from the things that, the stuff that things were made of and the way they came to be. So efficient and material causation. So final cause, formal cause, material cause, efficient cause, that's the Aristotelian approach to studying natural things. With Baconian science, two of those they're sloughed off, formal cause and final cause. And that's where the Christian faith constrained is with those causes.
And an important, a real quick point, and what that does is basically makes the material cause foundational. In other words, what is causal language doing for Aristotle, and why did the church find it useful? Because in reducing things to their causes, what you're showing is the things are not intelligible apart from something more intelligible in which they share in. And as creatures of a creator, they to get the intelligibility of what they are, why they are, and what they're for, you can't bracket them off from the most intelligible reality, which is God, as it's the originating cause and the purpose for which they're created. When you take them out of the picture, the intelligibility now of each thing is reduced to its physical chain of causes. And there isn't anything really higher. And so its function is really all it's for. And if you can play with that function to serve a higher function, which is our purposes, then it's basically clay for our molding without any constraints.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
Sorry, Glenn.
Yeah, now to take this back to Genesis, I think we've got a good argument in Genesis for doing science, for learning about the world as a means of exercising proper dominion over it. Mm-hmm. But the word that is really critical there is proper. Scripture is clear that the earth is the Lord's, it isn't ours. Mm-hmm. We have dominion here in the sense of stewardship, but we always have to remember that everything that we're working with here was made by God and belongs to God. And thus, as we work with the world, we should always be pursuing the proper ends, which is to develop the world to the glory of God and in conjunction with his lordship, not despoiling it, not perverting it, not taking it and using it for our purposes apart from him.
Now that's very true, and I'm 100% on board with it. I think one of the things that distinguished, say, Aristotelian thinking from what you just described, Glenn, is that Aristotelian thinking believed that you could discern within the things themselves their forms and ends. What you described is an insight into the purpose of the whole because of the unique relationship that we have as creatures to the divine, to God. And I think it's true. I'm not arguing with that. But I want to proceed a little bit here to explore kind of the implications of this, because it doesn't stop where we would like it to stop with air conditioning. If that's all it sort of resulted in, we'd all just say, "Hey, go for it, baby," but it doesn't. So what we see too is when we think about this sort of bifurcation with regard to the material and the purposeful, we can see the bifurcation we see between the sciences and the humanities, for example. Remember C.P. Snow and his two kingdoms or two? No, it wasn't two kingdoms. Anyway, he made an argument that maintained that the humanities and the sciences were just simply unable to communicate with each other, and that consequently both were impoverished. But I think what we've actually seen is a lot of surprising things develop, but it all kind of develops in a sort of progressive way. In, say, the 18th and 19th century, we see the introduction of the fact-value distinction. So facts are these, I think, data points that we're able to record, quantify, and then values are things that we sort of bring to the world that we possess, but they're subjective. So no longer do we look to the object and say, okay, what's the purpose of this thing? What's its form? Instead, we say, okay, this is just a sort of mechanistic universe that we find ourselves in. We can understand it using these data points, examining phenomena, getting our facts straight. But when it comes to the values, well, that's subjective, internal. You have your values, I have my values. There's no value to be found outside in the world.
And what's going on there is a certain understanding of the human as again, fundamentally centered in their volition. And that volition is almost like a mimicry of what it means to be God, in that it can generate out of its own resources meaning and purpose. These aren't grounded externally; they're grounded in the choosing or the dispositions of the agent. And so, what marks you as distinct as a human and gives you your dignity is your ability to basically stamp yourself as if you're God on the world. So, values are what you bring to the world. Purposes are what you project onto things, and meaning is what you construct, right? It's out of your inner resources, and these sometimes can be an exhibition of what external reality determines you to think, but they also can be what you spontaneously generate depending on the view of humanity you adopt.
Yeah, we lose objective value. There's no objective value, right?
Yeah, so no participation in anything fuller.
But what does that mean for knowledge? Well, that means that the only real knowledge is the knowledge that's quantifiable, that is derived from the observation of the facts material phenomena, etc. And anything that can't be put into those terms is second rate. It's your opinion. You believe in God. I believe in science. That kind of thing. You see where I'm going with this. So all knowledge that can't be shoehorned into this materialist approach is ipso facto not power and not verifiable. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, the best example of this, I think, is the word science itself. Originally, the Latin word from which we get science referred to any knowledge from a field that had a methodology attached to it.
Yeah.
Thus, theology was a science. Theology was the queen of the sciences and so on. All of these different fields were sciences. Around the 19th century, maybe late 18th into the 19th century, I haven't tracked the date exactly here, the word science or scientia gets limited to knowledge of the natural world, empirically verifiable, or, if you're a positivist, things that follow from logical necessity.
Yeah.
So science gets restricted to the way we use it today for the natural sciences. But that means that knowledge is being restricted to just the things coming out of the natural sciences, and everything else then falls into this area of value. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why, in order to defend and justify their existence, a number of fields created this area called the social sciences. Yeah. Because they wanted to say, no, this is real knowledge. This is really something that qualifies as knowledge. It isn't just opinion or anything.
Well, that's where you got, especially in Germany, the Wissenschaft, the whole traditions of social sciences is almost mimicking the natural sciences in terms of methodology. And even I think there's people like von Harnack, they wanted to make his history almost read in that on the model of natural science.
Now, the thing that is most disturbing about this trend is that what we are moving toward is knowledge as quantification, as opposed to something more capacious that could include quality. So this is another way to distinguish these two things. Yeah. So we have quantification. So quantitative social science is the science of the numbers, is the science of data points, is the science of sort of people and the choices that they make. And what we're trying to do is acquire a knowledge of human societies or human psychology that in some sense conforms to this science that we apply to the natural world. And now, what does this all kind of lead to? Well, it leads to one thing I've been hitting at for a while, and that is we have devalued, discounted, no longer count. We don't count things that can't be counted. Yeah, you get my drift here. So I'm playing with words a little bit, but quality. So let me introduce something completely different, but I think relevant. When I say I know my wife, how is that power? Now, we might be able to shoehorn that knowledge into an understanding, knowledge is into the understanding knowledge is power, the definition. But does it really fit?
Well, of course it does, Chris, because you're a patriarchal oppressor.
That's right. There you go. End of show.
But flip it to how rich the biblical language is for a husband and wife to know each other, and think of how close that is to knowledge of God and all things else. There's an communal intimacy that is the most. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. So, like the sentence. If we just look at the sentence, when I say, I know my wife, that's the subject. The object is wife. Know is the verb. I know my wife. Okay, so we've diagrammed the sentence. But is she really an object? In the real world, is my wife an object? Well, no, she's a fellow subject. So she knows me as I know her. Furthermore, the knowledge that we have of each other changes the other. So when I speak with my wife, I've changed my wife. What have I done? I've introduced something to her that was not in her mind before. And when she returns, says something to me in return, there's something that I know that I didn't know before. So there's a kind of transformation that occurs, but this can't be reduced to Baconian science. But does that somehow make it less valuable? No, it's actually far more valuable.
Well, in that, I think you're really getting a clear way of distinguishing the difference between, let's say, a classic Christian vision and what came after, is because, as we talked about enough, the fact of anything that isn't God is here because of God. It's a gift, and therefore it has something about it that is part of the give and take. In other words, it has something to give, but it's also gets something from you, right? You and other things are in a communicative relationship. Things communicate their being to you, and you also communicate your being to that. And it's in that sharing of communion that you know the other thing truly, and it truly knows you. And so when you bracket that off to where I am the only one who really has being, and I am giving any life or being to this thing, we aren't really knowing those things. What we are is only knowing enough about them to basically reaffirm myself as the whole thing, and that only here to gratify or serve.
That's exactly it. And that's what I'm getting at. There's something about Baconian science that's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
So let me just play this out a little bit, because I've been thinking a lot about this over the past week and a half as I've been sort of struggling to write a chapter on this.
It's not easy to get all the ramifications down. There's a lot going on.
Well, I can abstract from my knowledge of my wife something that could be, used as currency, a kind of data that would be useful to other people. It would actually help them exercise power. Let me give you an example. I know my wife loves chocolate. Now, my wife would say, amen. She would be right. Yep, that's exactly right. Now, with that knowledge, you can ingratiate yourself to my wife and in some sense exercise some influence, even though you don't have a relationship in the way that I do. Furthermore, I could take that information, and if somebody was collecting or making a list of chocolate lovers, depending on the size of the list and whether or not it contained their contact information, it could be very valuable to certain parties. Yeah. So let's say I had a list of chocolate lovers that was 3 million in number, and that information about my wife has some value and would mean power to a chocolate manufacturer, right? Because then they would have access to my wife. But is that knowing my wife the way I know my wife? Of course not. But that's the kind of knowledge that Bacon wants.
Right. And what I'm struck by is that within this framework of Baconian science, knowledge becomes utilitarian, just like ethics do.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the connection between epistemology and ethics is one of these things I find really interesting. But here's a clear example where utilitarian epistemology ultimately, I would argue, has to lead you to utilitarian ethics.
Right. And utilitarian ethics are the ethics of instrumentalizing knowledge and using it to get what you want. Now, let me think about this a couple more ways. So in Scripture, we're told that we see through a glass darkly. In other words, there's a sense in which our knowledge is incomplete. Well, our knowledge of whom is incomplete? Our knowledge of God and how things will work out and all these other things. But we're given a promise. Someday we will know as we are known. And what will happen on that day? We will be transformed. Mm-hmm. So there's a power that will be exercised on us through our knowledge of God. We will go from knowing in part to knowing fully. And because of that, we will be transformed. And until that day, we need power to know God. So when you think about the Apostle Paul and his address, what he has to say to the Ephesians, there I think it's in chapter 3 where he says that he prays that they would have the power to apprehend what is theirs in Christ So in other words, they need power to know. So it isn't as though knowledge is the key to power. They're in a position where they can't even know what they need to know and really would want to know without God's help, which again inverts everything. But what that does is it takes this whole matter of this communal aspect of knowledge to the highest level. So in that area, we don't exercise power over God. Through our knowledge, God's power is realized in our lives, and we're transformed. Whole different thing than McCoy science.
And again, the language early theologians used to talk about it, following right out of the scripture, is this, is participation in God's own self-knowledge. I mean, that creaturely share in it. So it's always something we're growing into. We can never circumscribe God or knowledge, but what we are is having God's disclosing. Right. And that's where your power comes, the power of the Spirit, right, is to bring us up into God's self-disclosure so that we can truly know in a creaturely way that truth of God in all things related to God. That's why I think the bracketing of theology from the sciences, I think also, or replacing it with a kind of hidden theology, as Mike Hanby likes to talk about, is, I think, one of the most dangerous things that is leading to the kind of, the flips we saw with Foucault and then really their outplay. See, what you have going on is when you do have knowledge is power take on this kind of positivistic scientism that developed, whether it is a deterministic type of, naturalism or materialism, whether it's a dialectical type, whether it's a historicism, right? It's just, the unfolding of all things in the flux of history, or a kind of libertarianism in which, we, through our choice, are kind of transcending the creaturely to bring it under our submission and will. I think all of those things are serving a kind of bad theology, and therefore a bad set of aims and purposes. And those things have marginalized large swaths of reality that are coming back with a vengeance. And so a lot of what we see as, the horrendous outflow of postmodernity and all this kind of, transgender issue and all of this, it's kind of flooding back in with the criticism that this knowledge of power move marginalized so many things that everything now wants to claim back into what can be considered knowledge. So
let me just take that in a direction that maybe will surprise folks. So, and I'll show in a minute how this connects, but let me take a step back and say something first. When we think about the classic understanding of political liberty, it entailed participation in the governing of the community through voting, but also through deliberation and debate, right? So a truly free person was a person who was able to participate in self-governance and in some cases restrict himself through the political process. We're not going to allow businesses to open on Sunday. That's the town meeting. We've debated the subject. We've come to a decision. A judgment's been rendered. The law has been passed. So, but you're still politically free in that understanding because you can participate in an ongoing way in deciding whether or not that law should be overturned. But that's the point. You've been enfranchised. You're part of the franchise because you can participate. Now, something happened in the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century where all of that was thrown out the window. It was the rise of the progressive movement. And the progressive movement is progressivism as it applies to government, enlightened sort of macro management of nations. We see it develop in France with bureaucracy, bureau, French word. And so what you end up with is this vast machine which more or less regulates the state. And so you have this apparatus, this administrative state that exists within this larger constitutional republic. And over time, what we've seen is more and more sort of daily, sort of effective power transfer from legislative bodies to the administrative state. Christopher Caldwell, one of the guys who's part of the Claremont Institute, wrote a book a little while back called, I think it's titled The Second Constitution. Basically, it's a kind of a living constitution, the living constitution of the administrative state, which really is the now. How does this all apply to totalitarianism? Well, it applies in this way: you've got to have the apparatus and the mindset that it reflects, which is really has its origin in Baconian science. In order to get totalitarianism, you need the administrative state. And you need an administrative state that cares more about controlling things than seeing the will of the people or seeing the deliberative process unfold. What that means is that they're very interested in the social sciences. They're interested in the ways in which the social sciences give them insight into controlling populations and how to do that.
Yeah.
So we become subjects of the administrative state, managed, controlled, directed in a variety of ways. Now, where Foucault comes in is the administrative state is this marvelously absorbing entity. It's like the Borg. It'll take anything you want. So, okay, you're into transgenderism. We can do that for you. We can make that a function of the administrative state. We can police and sort of manipulate, sort of the libraries that rely on us for their funding, the public schools for the same. We have these vast bureaucracies that spend nothing, they do nothing except think up new rules all day long to promulgate and pass around. That's how they justify their existence. But and all of this stuff is made possible by this statement: knowledge is power. Yeah, that's my thesis anyway.
Yeah, just an observation. The probably clearest example of this is that the vast majority of the functional laws that we live under are not passed by any legislature. Yeah. They're done by bureaucratic fiat because the legislature offloads the responsibility. They give you a general framework for the law, and then they offload the responsibility on what that means to the bureaucracy. And they write up all the rules in terms of how that's supposed to work out. And I would argue in many cases it takes it in very different directions than was intended by Congress in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think you can see what I'm getting at is that what's happened is we've gone from being citizens to subjects, but not subjects in the old sense. In the old sense, at least, a good king would recognize his responsibility to care for his subjects in ways that were in accordance with divine law and so forth. That's not the case here. What we have is we're subjects to a bunch of pseudoscientists who are interested in data that allow them to manipulate and control a vast population.
Yeah, and I think I often reflect on it from the angle of the church and especially in our context and culture and a lot of conditions that have to be in place for it to weaken in so many dimensions, especially morally and its public witness. We've been over a lot of these, but you think of how easy it is to capitulate for so many Christians. It has taken a long time to break the will of the church, if you will, over and over again, to where it just really became, it's navel gazing, or it's just focusing up on, what it is for it to be okay in its small little context, and really this intimidation that if it's going to be proclaiming the truth of things, of God and everything else, that really somehow it's entered a sphere of being intolerant, or it's bought the values of liberalism to the point at which the radical dimensions that have now entered and replaced liberalism have been able to bank on the church buying into liberalism to where it can wreak havoc, because the church is basically functioning out of its weakening under a liberal social order. And what I mean by that is, for example, it's relativism and it's tolerating everything.
I want to make things worse in a minute, but I can see that Glenn has something to say before I lay on you something even more depressing.
Well, I'll match you depressing almost any day of the week. But what I was going to do a historical observation here. You get the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the early 20th century in the Presbyterian Church and parallel movements elsewhere. What ends up happening is the modernists win. And so what we see emerging in mainstream Christianity, mainstream Protestantism in America, is liberal Protestantism. And in the meantime, the conservatives picked up their marbles and went home. And basically, you've got your fundamentalist groups that just talk to themselves and they won't participate in society or anything else. That is the context in which progressivism arises. Progressivism comes when the church withdraws from being salt and light in society.
Yeah. And the fundamentalism internalized a metaphysics of modernity in its expressing classical Christian views. So it already had its own, we see it today with its just reaction against anything that isn't fundamentalism. And so the reactionism and the inability to answer with the substantive riches of Christianity as salt and light has really shown itself in just how much it internalized the modern world, even in its attempt to be separate from it.
So let me just return for a moment to this notion of knowledge in the sense that is full, having really a central place for this kind of communal knowing that we've just been talking about. God knowing us knowing God, a man knowing his wife knowing him, citizens knowing each other and engaging in conversation and debate over what's in the best interest of all. So all of that's been shoved aside, pushed aside, and it's been replaced by progressivism. But progressivism in what sense? Well, progressivism in the sense that we're now trying to govern scientifically and using data that is accumulated from different sources. Now, we've had this going on for a very long time. But it's kind of amped up. It's kind of gone to another level with the rise of social media and computing. So there are data now that the Nazis and the Soviets would have dreamed and drooled over. Yeah. If you think of what would they have been able to accomplish if they just had this? that now I know we could talk about whether or not that kind of technology could have even emerged in those systems, but. Yeah. Nevertheless,
but we can answer the question by looking at China today.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Total control. Yeah. So how does it work, though? Well, the thing about Baconian science, because of its tendency to objectify everything, it can't be that the knower can't be known, mustn't be known. That would spoil the objective status of the knower. So the whole process of knowing is behind a facade or, say, a two-way mirror. Think about it this way. So when you think about a two-way mirror, from one side, you can see yourself. Hey, there I am. You can pick your teeth. You can do something embarrassing, in front of the mirror. All the while, there's somebody on the other side of the mirror because from that side, it's a window. And that's what we have with this approach to data gathering that we see in our society today. And that's what's happening right now as we're engaged in creating this show. Because there are people who are listening. Now, they're not listening in, but they're recording everything. There is a listening station in Utah that's run by the National Security Administration, NSA, that is recording this show. It's on their servers.
Yeah, I've seen one of the servers in someone's basement, and I had no idea what it was when I saw it, and I couldn't find it now. But it is, yeah, it's kind of a little disturbing. This has been going on for a long time. But one of the things that I think another aspect of this is, again, we're talking a lot about the way in which this notion of kind of enlightenment way of getting control of things, objectifying, and this is just made worse with flooding society with its kind of chaotic alternative where there is no truth, or truth is only what your group identity is it shares in a kind of communal knowing and interpretation of the world, and anything that dismisses that or doesn't embrace that becomes a threat to it, to that truth, your truth, my truth. But one of the things that you really don't see, and this is kind of tied to your point, and this is one of the few things I hear a lot of even Christians address is, I think this was my point a little earlier with the church, is it never really or rarely turned the wheels back on those that are driving the train. Like you said, they're oftentimes far removed, but most philosophies and philosophers that are having the kind of impact they're having, if you apply their own stuff to themselves, they're guilty of everything. It's just like this. Anybody who's trying to claim, that someone else is an oppressor by asserting their knowledge and enforcing on others, they're doing the same thing. And the claim, exemption that you can skip out of it. So, I mean, the amounts of rational, irrational jumps through loops and avoidances to not have their own theories thrown back on them is unbelievable.
Well, I think we're on the cusp of perhaps a breakthrough. And what I mean by that is I think that some people are beginning to finally put it all together and realize that that they've painted themselves into a corner in modernity, and the thing that they need isn't in reach with regard to what we have available. And they're beginning to look up and reaching for the skyhook to deliver them. And I'm thinking of one person in particular, and that's Paul Kingsnorth. So Paul Kingsnorth is a fascinating guy. And by the way, I'm in the process right now of trying to connect with him. I've got somebody that knows him that's helping me to connect with him, and I'd love to get him on the show. But this is a guy who was considered a pretty radical green in the UK, almost to the point of being kind of so far out there that people wondered if he was in touch with reality. Anyway, but he's completely turned on the green movement, and it's because he believes it's been co-opted by the machine. And he's just as appalled as anyone by all the crazy stuff we see in the name of the green agenda. People flying from all over the world to places to talk about how they can maybe ruin your farm. That kind of stuff. But he has recently become a Christian, and has become a very vocal one. He now owns a small farm in Ireland, and he's kind of doing some intellectual work on this stuff that's really fascinating. He's kind of like the next generation of Wendell Berry, and I think he's got some insight into some of the stuff that Berry misses. And anyway, we'll have I'll get you some stuff that he's written here in the future. But he's on this, and there are more and more people like this guy who are like
there are, and I know in academic
people.
Yeah, and I know in the academics for years, you saw a lot of these. We could talk about Thomas Kuhn's notion of scientific revolutions and the way in which fact and value are far more integrated, right? The way in which interpretation, the personal and the factual are a fuller holistic whole, and some could see that as leading to relativism. It wasn't intended that way. It was just to reintegrate humanities and the interpretive shaping with the interaction with the factual world. But then you remember Michael Polanyi, personal knowledge, and he had a really strong impact on the way in which the tacit is always involved in. And I think again they're reaching towards something that was left, and a holistic ontology in which there is a much more intimate relationship between all creaturely things and knowing, in which the fact value distinction is just done away with. And that doesn't mean that there aren't ways of engaging reality that are more true than others. It's the exact opposite. There are, because there are really gifts that are giving themselves and you're exchanging yourself with, that are communicating, and that communication is built into the reality of things, and it therefore gives a fuller, richer knowledge that can include all of those dimensions of our humanness and those things external to us, without closing the door or turning them into manipulated ways of relating.
Yeah, and I think that we're like I hope I was able to convey. I think we're at a really interesting time. You know, the old Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." But I think there's some reason for hope, insofar as the best minds. That's the thing. The best minds are not caught up in CRT. The best minds are not wrapped up in transgender justifying transgender nuttiness. And the best minds across the board are like, what in the world is going on? We're at a place that's not good. What's missing? And a lot of people, really sharp people, are asking good questions right now. It doesn't get. It's not stuff you see on CNN or Fox News or whatever, But if you're kind of tapped in to some things that are really important, there is encouraging stuff going on. So, I mean, Paul Kingsnorth, his Substack has a 30,000 member list that subscribe to his Substack. So this guy now. You have to work to find the guy. It's not like he's promoting himself all over America. He's not like Joe Rogan or something like that. But people who are like really wondering what in the world is going on are discovering guys like Paul Kingsnorth.
Yeah.
Something you said earlier, moving off of a philosophical level for the moment, something you said earlier I think is really important, and that's this idea of the bureaucracy. The bureaucratic system, the administrative state, whatever you want to call it, is trying to apply science, Baconian science to governance. Now, the thing that's significant about that on one level is that political systems always parallel economic systems. So you have feudalism as a political system, you have manorialism as the economic system that goes with it, because both of them are based on a shared set of assumptions about natural human relations. Capitalism, or free market economics, as I prefer to call it, goes really well with representative government, because they're based on the same fundamental ideas that, I will buy what a politician is selling me. I will vote for a store to stay in business with my dollars. I mean, they're basically the same kind of thing. Once you move away from a truly representative system to a system that's controlled by experts, by bureaucrats, by technocracy, any of those things, you automatically undermine free market economics. Because what ends up happening is, if the expert is the one who determines what should happen in terms of laws and politics and things like that, the expert is also the one who controls the economy.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so you inevitably move towards something like socialism.
Yeah, and what we find too is that in the process they lose sight of human beings because they're reduced to objects. There's a loss of confidence or a loss of faith in the real presence. And I used that in the last show that we were, in our last conversation. When I think of the significance of real presence for politics, I think it's implicit in what you were describing, Glenn, free market economics and Republican government. It's implicit. There is someone out there, and that someone is like me, and I'm real, and he's real, or she's real, And because that's the case, the way that we interact with each other has to be done in a way that acknowledges the agency of the other, the rights of the other, we're not just simply subject to the laws of whatever you want to say the law is, economics or what have you. There's real presence out there.
A couple of observations from Canada. Right now, I just saw this week, there's an article arguing that physician-assisted suicide can save the state a lot of money.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. If you really want to save a lot of money, kill them all.
Right.
You get sick, you die.
The other one was that there was a Canadian veteran and a Paralympian who was trying to get a ramp put in at their house so that she could, at her house or at somewhere, so that she could have easier access. The state wouldn't fund that, but they offered to euthanize her.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, where the bureaucracy has its own logic that excludes the person, that excludes the human.
Yeah. At least at this point, they didn't just move in and take her and euthanize her. At least they still said, "Hey, you got a choice. You can die, or die." But there's no ramp for you.
Yeah. Well, I think critics of where, for example, the U.S. has went with its kind of distorted view of freedom in relationship, almost like the notion that the choice through the unpremised choice. In other words, you have nothing other than what you want and what you choose governing everything, is that, it has led to this kind of marketability of one's own body identity, and think that, well, if you want to choose to be, a cat, you can be a cat. If you want to choose, and everyone else has to affirm it. So you have kind of distorted views with when the layers aren't in place, and that is a perversion of what was set out to be, a proper view of free market and the relationship of responsibility. But
that only exists in carefully circumscribed areas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Try being an election denier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
any number of other things related to taboo areas. There are taboo areas where you are not allowed to go. But within the small circumscribed area of how you define your own identity, you can do it any way you want to.
Yeah. I remember when I was at Harvard, I made this very point in a class, and man, I really got them mad at me. I said, your notions of freedom are so narrow and so petty. What I'm advocating here, when I'm advocating, a free market, is the kind of agency that you guys freak out over. You can't handle. You don't want to acknowledge that kind of freedom because it's an exercise in power or with power that makes you nervous. But I think, as we're kind of wrapping this up, as we think about this matter, what I'm getting at is totalitarianism is a kind of scientific approach to managing a population. And when it is in full force, when it's sort of got all of the pieces in place that it really wants to have, it's total in character. It leaves no space for anything that can't be subjected or isn't subjected to its control. And that's what makes it such a terrible thing, and also which makes it such a frightening thing. And we are in a situation now where we have the means to pull off a kind of totalitarianism that the world was maybe hinting at, or certain regimes were hinting at in the past, but didn't have the means to bring about. But now we've got the means, and it's spooky stuff. Anyway, anything you guys want to say as we wrap up?
Well, I think what you have also is, a rearrangement of things to where what is considered good is a cheap substitute for the good. And because of that, what you have is you eradicate freedom, which in the classic sense and Christian sense is the endowment to truthfully enact your creatureliness creatureliness with all of its gifts, in accord with the highest good that is drawing them towards their perfection. So if you change what the good is that which you want, or the good is that which we say it is, right? Or what we're going to determine it. I think that's where we're dealing with right now in a lot of the Western world. We have, those that have enthroned themselves to basically tell us what is good for us and how we should orient ourselves towards it. They're substituting their good for the good. They're identifying their authority given by God as if it is God's authority and God. And I think that's where the totalitarian disposition, they're not servants of God in their mind, they are God.
And I think this gives us a basis for rebellion, a legitimate basis for resistance. Glenn?
I think I've said about as much as I really need to say for this episode, so we'll call it a day for me.
All right. Well, thank you, folks, for listening to the Theology Pugcast. You've made it to the end of this episode, and we're glad that you have. We have many people who listen on an ongoing basis to the show. We get reports, we get notes, get letters, emails, etc., from different people in different parts of the world, and we're very grateful that people care about the things that we care about. And then there are also people who give to the show in an ongoing way. We've got folks who support us on Patreon, and there's a link in the show notes for anyone who'd like to become a patron of the show. We have people who support us through the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network, and those are great folks, and we appreciate what we receive through that good organization. And we also are looking forward to a whole new year. We're entering into another year, and we've got some exciting things in store for folks. And we're still kind of building this wagon as we ride it. We're kind of figuring out how to make it all work as we go along. But even so, even though it's just us and we're kind of clumsy when it comes to technology, we've got people who come along behind us and sweep it all up and make it suitable for public consumption. And we're grateful to those folks too. But most of all, we're grateful to the Lord. And he's the one who's the source of all good things. And the gifts that we have are given to us by him. And so we thank him, and we thank you as well. So enough for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.